Lyndon Johnson became president on November 22nd, 1963. As your book said, at 2:38, he took the oath of office. He took it aboard Air Force One. There's a very famous photo. He is standing there, hand on the Bible. His wife is there, and Jackie Kennedy is actually next to him as well. And the president's coffin is in the background of Air Force One. Very weird way for a person to assume the duties of the President of the United States, but he did so because we could not have a lapse in the office, so to speak. Johnson was also fully aware that he had to reassure people that things were going to be handled. America was in shock at what had happened to John F. Kennedy. And so Johnson felt that he had a duty to assure people that things would keep moving, and in the next couple of weeks he was going to act quickly on certain matters to try and again show that we're going to get past this. Now I have to take a moment to explain President Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is originally from Texas, and he had a unique style all of his own. He had spent 26 years, as you can see, in Congress. He had served in the House of Representatives, the Senate. He had been Senate Majority Leader. He was chosen to be John F. Kennedy's vice president. He is actually a great example of what we used to do, really quickly. It used to be not very uncommon that the parties would take whoever was kind of the runner-up and they would make them the vice president. See, John F. Kennedy won the nomination after a lot of contest. Johnson was one of the favorites going in, and when he didn't win, he was kind of the second, he was, second place runner-up. He was chosen to be the vice president for JFK. Same thing with George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was chosen as Ronald Reagan's vice president kind of because he was the second most popular Republican candidate in the field. You guys have seen a few presidential campaigns where we have a person win and then they pick somebody that wasn't even running against them to be president, to be vice president. But that's not how it used to work, actually. But Lyndon Johnson has been around the block. He spent over 2 decades working the halls and offices of Capitol Hill. And as he moved up the ladder, he, as your book said, and it is something that you have to do in order to get this position. He's a man who gets things done. He's a man who gets things passed. Why? Because of what historians have come to call the Johnson treatment. Lyndon Johnson's personality was quite large and forward, aggressive. But he didn't just bully people. He didn't just intimidate people. Johnson was known for being a master manipulator. Lyndon Johnson knew the people that he could bully. He knew the people that he would have to negotiate with. He knew what made people tick. When you spend 26 years working the halls of Congress, and some of those people are there all those 26 years, you build a very solid relationship. For people that maybe haven't been there as long, Johnson would do his homework. He'd find out. He knew the people who were very stat-driven, right? And he knew that he couldn't argue emotionally to you. He would have to win you over with statistics. So when he'd meet with you, when he'd present whatever it is he wanted to present, he'd have charts, he'd have graphs, he'd have facts and figures and numbers, right? On the other side, if he has been told through his research that you're the kind of person who, if you can somehow make it an argument about children, you'll melt, right? And he'll win your vote. Johnson would go in and cry in your office and about the children, right, to win your vote. Then he'd go down the hall and have a drink with his buddy of 26 years and get his vote. And then he'd go down the hall and he would intimidate and threaten a rookie congressman to get his vote. And so that's why it's called the Johnson treatment, because it varied. It wasn't, well, I should rephrase that. It's called the Johnson treatment in part because it's a unique thing of Lyndon Johnson's. Lyndon Johnson was well known for his ability to build consensus, to bring people together and create a general agreement, a coalition, if you will. But again, it was because he could read people. He knew how to work people. He knew how to change his tactics. He was very versatile like that. He wasn't just some loud Texan who walked in the room and kind of bullied you into a corner. That is why he was one of the most effective leaders in the history of the United States Senate. He's one of the greatest Senate majority leaders ever because of his ability to work the crowd. Now, when Johnson became president, he is going to, turn his attention to what he considered to be a very important topic. Now, I do know that we've already talked about he got the 1964 Civil Rights Bill passed. He began to really, though, push a war on poverty. This is something that John F. Kennedy had started to kind of hint at as well. But Lyndon Johnson was a big believer in we had to combat poverty. Now, Johnson liked to overplay his childhood poverty. He had hard times as a kid here and there, but don't think that Lyndon Johnson grew up like without food and stuff. His family was not well to do by any stretch. He did go through bouts of hard times, parents basically barely getting by. He didn't live in the nicest of places. So he had experiences with what it was like to be on the lower income spectrum. But he had seen a lot of poverty when he worked as a teacher in a low-income area, something I touched upon with the Civil Rights Bill. One of the reasons he was an ardent champion of civil rights. He had a lot of experience with minorities from his brief teaching career. He understood the gap in wealth in this country, and he understood the suffering that many of our impoverished went through. And he believed that a country that was experiencing the wealth boom that we were experiencing, the quality of life, there was no reason that we should have the poverty that we had in our country still. And as I said, there was already strong support to do this, and he decided he could keep it going. And this is going to sound really terrible. He could play off of, again, John F. Kennedy was a martyr, right? John F. Kennedy was a murder victim. And he could kind of turn this into a John F. Kennedy legacy, right? And sort of we're going to finish something John F. Kennedy started. We're going to do it for the man. And so he began to, focus during his State of the Union address to Congress in 1964. He talked about how we were going to wage an unconditional war on poverty. In the summer of 1964, Johnson was able to get Congress to create the Office of Economic Opportunity. He actually got them to pass the Economic Opportunity Act, which created a number of programs to help people economically, including the Office of Economic Opportunity, which would coordinate all these new programs. For example, he noticed that for a lot of people living in the inner city, there weren't a lot of opportunities. There weren't a lot of options. And so he created the Neighborhood Youth Corps, which would create work-study programs to help people earn their high school diploma, maybe a college degree. He created Job Corps. Its job was to try and help unemployed people find work. And one other one he created was VISTA, Volunteers in Service of America, or Service to America. It was kind of like a Peace Corps for the United States. The idea is you would get people to volunteer to go work in the lower income, inner city neighborhoods, rural areas, and basically start programs to help people that were poor come out of their poverty or improve their conditions. So this is all in his first year as president. So think about it. His first year in president, he got the Civil Rights Act of '64 passed. He actually got a tax cut passed. And then he passed a number of anti-poverty programs. Now, 1964, that's the other thing I have to point out. Lyndon Johnson took the office of president less than 12 months before an election. John F. Kennedy is assassinated November 22nd, 1963. There's going to be an election the first week of November of 1964. He's got less than 12 months to be president, to kind of accomplish some stuff, to run for office, right? Well, 1964 pitted Lyndon Johnson versus Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a Republican Arizona senator. All right. Barry Goldwater was incredibly outspokenly conservative. Matter of fact, during his speech to accept the Republican nomination, he famously said, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." Um, this man could be the most staunchly conservative candidate the Republican Party has ever put forth. I know that everyone likes to, I jokingly like to talk about everybody with their Reagan, tattoo. Everybody loves Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was not near as conservative as Barry Goldwater, both in his rhetoric and if you look at his record as president. Ronald Reagan met the Democrats halfway an awful lot. I don't think Barry Goldwater would have met the Democrats a quarter of the way. This guy was super duper ultra conservative. Um, Now you have to realize we are only 2 years out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came to the brink of nuclear war, right? And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed and negotiations occurred and all that good stuff, right? And here's a guy who's talking about defending liberty. He made a lot of anti communist talk. And for a lot of Americans, there was concern that this guy, he won't work with the Russians. He'll fight them, and it will lead to nuclear war. So here you have the Republicans made buttons that said, in your heart, you know he's right. And the Democrats in return made buttons that said, in your guts, you know he's nuts. And so the big topic in the 64 election really became who is going to navigate us successfully through the tensions of the Cold War, right? It wasn't about war on poverty. Honestly, the hot topic was who is going to be able to get us through the cold, to not get us killed in this Cold War, right? There was a famous commercial I usually show. It's called Daisy. It's a little girl picking petals off a daisy flower, um, and she's counting, right? And all of a sudden, it turns into a voiceover of a countdown. And when it gets to zero, the little girl counting the flower petals is replaced by a nuclear bomb explosion. And then, Lyndon Johnson talks about these are the stakes, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and it's considered to be one of the first great television ads because it really caught people off guard. Little girl in the field counting petals on a flower. All of a sudden, she's wiped out in a nuclear blast. And Lyndon Johnson saying, you vote for Barry Goldwater, is what you're going to get. If you're curious, it wasn't even close. Lyndon Johnson shellacked Barry Goldwater. As you can see in the popular vote, 61 to 38. In the Electoral College, it's a walk-off home run. Now, I want to point out something, though, and this is something Richard Nixon noticed, right? Notice the only place, I'm not counting Arizona, Barry Goldwater's from Arizona. The only place that Barry Goldwater got any electoral votes was the South. Barry Goldwater is a Republican. When was the last time a Republican did well down here, right? And I guess I should rephrase, in a hotly contested election, no less, right? I'm not counting the 1928 Herbert Hoover beats Alfred Smith, a Catholic, not exactly a Catholic region, right? I mean, I'm talking a truly hotly contested election, right? When was the last time a Republican did well down here? Answer, pretty much never, right? This has been Democratic South since ever, right? And here Barry Goldwater snags 5 states with his ultra-conservative rhetoric. The Republicans are going to tap into what they see as a growing trend, but we're not there yet. But spoiler alert, we will get there soon when we get to Richard Nixon. It's called the Southern Strategy. It looks like the South is drifting from its Democratic roots. As you can see, county by county, Barry Goldwater did very well in certain parts of the South, especially Mississippi. Loves the man. I think he did better in Mississippi than he did in his home state of Arizona. You know, but you can see a lot of blue, and it is reflective in how the final vote went down. So Johnson wins a humongous win in '64. After his election, Lyndon Johnson began pushing what is known as the Great Society. During the campaign, Lyndon Johnson had talked about his plan for a wide sweeping program that would wipe out poverty and uplift America. Think of like a New Deal, only we're not doing it to get out of a depression. We're doing it just to make America awesome. The Great Society was his way of creating a more equitable and fair society. right? In his eyes, he was just kind of fulfilling the idea of we're all created equal and everybody's going to get a fair and equal shot, and we're going to use our wealth to eliminate poverty and all that. You have to remember, Johnson admired Franklin Roosevelt. We can't forget Franklin D. Roosevelt in the New Deal. Johnson, gentlemen, is old enough. You know, he was 55 years old when he became president in 1963. Um, you know, he was in his 20s when FDR was elected. You know, he fully remembers the New Deal. He lived through it. He probably benefited from some New Deal programs when he was younger, possibly. Uh, he loved FDR and the New Deal. He thought it was a great idea, and he felt that he was going to basically do what the New Deal did. A lot of programs that the government would run and pay for that would help American people and uplift them, right? Now, I also want to put this in a little bit of context. America is experiencing a humongous economic boom, right? The 50s were a golden age economically for America. Um, the train was still running in the early 60s, so to speak. We were still having economic growth. We were still having a lot of success. You know, wealth was up. You have to also remember this is the era of the civil rights movement. You know, we had a large group of Americans calling for more equality politically and legally, and we, you know, they were earning it. There was this idea that America was finally gonna solve a lot of long-term problems, right? Things that have been sitting there for decades. That we were finally gonna get some of these things taken care of in this new era, right? So, you know, while he might have had lofty goals, I don't want you to think he was a complete moron in his desire to eliminate poverty and bring about a more fair and equitable society. He felt like America was in a place it could do so, right? Um, he didn't, by the way, just want to help the poor, right? It wasn't just about, oh, we're going to use the government's money to eliminate poverty. As he said, he wanted to build a country um, where everyone would benefit, where everyone would have a place, a role, and that we would kind of work as a society to move forward and better ourselves throughout the future, right? So let's look at a few examples. And this chart was in your book. Um, and rather than type a bunch of notes, it's just easier to look at the chart sometimes, guys. For example, um, more than 60 programs. That's the other thing. That's why sometimes notes might not be the best move. 60 programs were passed. I mean, this is like the New Deal 2.0. I could rattle off 60 different programs if you wanted me to. They are all part of the Great Society in 3 years. That's the other thing. Johnson was only president until 1968. In 3 years, they're going to cook off 60 programs. Okay? Medicare and Medicaid, talking about health and welfare. Okay? Health reform had been talked about since Harry Truman in the 1940s, right? And you guys thought it was just Barack Obama who talked about health care. Health care has been debated since the 1940s, and Lyndon Johnson decided it's time to do something. In 1965, half of the elderly in this country had no health insurance. Half of the elderly, people over 65 and over. That shouldn't be a shock when you think about it. A lot of people get their health insurance through their employer, right? It's part of your employment package. Well, most old people aren't employed. They're retired. They don't have an employer to help them get health care or health insurance. And so half of the elderly were unemployed, or excuse me, uninsured. Okay? It has nothing to do with poverty, by the way, right? It's just they're uninsured. There were many elderly folks who had a decent place to live. They had money set aside. They weren't living on, you know, bread and water. They were okay, but they literally had no health insurance. Okay? Johnson convinced Congress to create what's called Medicare, a health insurance program that would be funded through Social Security. Look at that. Through Social Security. Okay? They were like, we've got all this money sitting there. Let's go ahead and use it for a health insurance program for the elderly, right? Social Security helps the elderly. Medicare had another program attached to it, Medicaid. Medicaid would be health care for people on welfare, those who are below the poverty line, right? And so this was This is for the elderly. Medicare is for the elderly. Medicaid is for those that are in poverty. All right. Um, and so this is what is called an entitlement program, in the sense that certain categories of Americans are entitled to the benefits. I do want to point out that today these are very expensive programs that have become permanent features of the American budget. Right? So, and as your population gets older and lives longer, the bill for Medicare gets bigger every year because you have more people who are on it. Again, one of those unintended consequences, right? But beyond talking about helping provide people with some sort of healthcare programs, education. Remember, Lyndon Johnson had been a school teacher, although briefly, Lyndon Johnson had been a school teacher, and education was a personal passion of his. Okay? For example, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It set aside millions of dollars to both public and private schools to provide textbooks, library materials, set up special education programs, right? It also mentions here adult education account. Those are some of those programs. The idea of the local high school would create a program to help adults who maybe had not completed their high school education get their diploma, things of that nature. They also started Project Head Start. Project Head Start, which was actually to be overseen or managed by the Office of Economic Opportunity. Remember the Office of Economic Opportunity, right? Head Start was a preschool program to be overseen by the Office of Economic Opportunity. Lyndon Johnson understood that preschool, while some of us mock it, preschool is very important. Preschool kind of it's the first building block in an education. And it has been shown statistically that kids who don't attend preschool before kindergarten generally do not perform as well in education long term. Just like kids who don't go to kindergarten tend to perform. It's, the earlier a kid is exposed to education and the earlier the foundation is laid, the better off they will be. And Lyndon Johnson pointed out that for a lot of people, and for those of you who are like, why is this the Office of Economic Opportunity? Who can't afford preschool? Poor people in the city. That's who. People living in the poor income neighborhoods, they can't afford to take what little money they have and use it to send their kid to a preschool program. Preschool is not free, right? And so the idea of Project Head Start was to create government-funded preschools that would be available to lower-income folks so their children would also have an opportunity to attend preschool. Another program, Upward Bound, to provide college prep for low-income teenagers, right? Up here also, not really mentioned in your text, but Higher Education Act, right? Government-provided scholarships, student loan, work-study programs. I would like to point out, for any of you who will be getting some sort of federal financial aid for college, okay, you should thank Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson's the man who really got that ball going. The Higher Education Act was the beginning of massive government sponsorship of higher education. And had it not been for the Great Society, you, like my parents, would have to find a way to pay for your college education on your own. My parents are both old enough that they were through it all before Great Society, right? My dad graduated high school in '54. My mom graduated high school in the early '60s, so she would have had to have figured out a way to pay for college without any government support. And it's hard, right? It's hard for the average family to find a way to foot a $10,000 or $15,000 a year bill. I mean, it's like paying for tough calf, and some of your families have to make sacrifices to pay for that. And not everybody can afford to do that. And so Lyndon Johnson said, look, if people want to get an education, we got to provide them with ways. And so this was the start of basically federal financial aid. Now, health and education are only one part of the Great Society, right? Lyndon Johnson understood conditions in the cities were getting worse every year. As he said, America's cities are in crisis. Poor schools, crime, slum housing, pollution. Some of this goes back to topics I've talked about, but changing demographics, white flight, all the people who can afford it are going to the suburbs. The people who are left behind can't afford to leave, right? They can't get out. They're trapped. And as more and more property becomes available, it becomes cheaper, and it actually becomes a magnet for low-income people looking for some sort of housing. And what you end up are cities full of poor people. And the cities get their taxes from the people who live in the cities. And so cities no longer have the money to fund or finance anything, right? And so the police departments are overwhelmed. The school systems are overwhelmed. There's no money to fix or improve anything, right? To address some of these issues, for example, Lyndon Johnson had a new cabinet position created, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. People like to call it HUD, but Department of Housing and Urban Development. In 1965, Robert Weaver was named to be the head of it, the first African American to serve in the United States cabinet. Okay, the idea was to create model cities, right? The idea that there would be federal subsidies to help cities across America to fix them and kind of bring them up to a standard. Improve transportation, healthcare, housing, the police situation, etc. Also, demolish some of those slums, get rid of some of those old, 70, 80-year-old horrific buildings that are overcrowded and run down and are no good for anybody. Bulldoze them and replace them, right? $8 billion was authorized to provide income for low-income and middle-income folks for housing, right? And so this was part of the Housing and Development Act, okay? Another part of this, the demonstration cities, right? This was the model city concept, right? The idea of we're going to create all these programs, provide all this funding to rebuild and revitalize. I do want to point out, too, one thing that occurred under the Great Society, immigration reform. The Immigration Reform Act of 1965. This did maintain a quota system, okay? America would each year take 170,000 immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere and 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere, but it eliminated national origins. You remember when we talked about immigration post-World War I, how I said how the National Origins Act gave 87% of our immigration quota to Northern and Western Europeans, right? We had a strict quota or total for the United States immigration, but 87% of that number was reserved for people from Northern and Western European countries. We aren't doing away with quotas yet. We're still going to have hard quota numbers, but what they are is just hemispherical in the sense of we don't care what part of Europe you are from. Or Africa. We're giving a block of spots to that chunk of the world. Good luck, right? This opened the door of the United States to all people from Asia, Africa, Europe. And so this was the beginning of a more diverse immigration to this country, right? You're going to start to see a lot more people from Southern Asia, like India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, right? You are going to see a sudden uptick in African immigration to this country, right? People who previously really weren't able to come to this country because there simply weren't spots. There just weren't any spots available, right? Because of our previous quota system. Also over here, again, not talked about as much by your book, but I'll mention there were efforts to improve, environmental concerns. There were efforts to improve consumer safety, right? This was the beginnings of things like, seatbelt laws and manufacturer safety laws and stuff like that, right? So it wasn't just, oh, we're going to help the cities, we're going to help the poor people and the old people. This was designed everyone, right? Everyone would benefit from these. This is the kind of thing that would affect all socioeconomic strata of American society. Now, Great Society, gentlemen, touched about everybody's life in some way or form, right? I do want to point out, though, the Great Society, like all massive government programs, has come under a lot of scrutiny in the decades since it was created, okay? And we have to ask ourselves, was it a success? The Great Society did not meet its goals. Why? Well, Johnson did not. I mean, he was so, we got to get this done, we got to get that done, we got to get this done, we got to get that done. It's like the New Deal, right? He's got a lot of things to get done, and he's just rushing them through, and he wasn't able to take account for the interplay of the different programs. It's like it's hard to explain if you don't have a better understanding of government bureaucracy. And it's funny because it's the topic where we're looking at in my government class right now. It's not just as simple as, oh, we're going to have a program to help poor people. A lot of rules and regulations obviously have got to be written up. And there's a lot of what we term red tape, right? And it makes it difficult to administer programs. It makes it difficult to make them as streamlined and effective and as efficient as you might want them to be. A problem is people were let down by the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson stood up and basically promised to make America this perfect place, and then these programs that came out did not do what people thought they would do or go as far or as fast. And it's the nature of government and bureaucracy. It can't deliver everything that's promised because you've got to have all the rules in place. Programs were they grew very quickly. They became unwieldy very quickly, and they're hard to evaluate because they aren't just doing one thing either, right? They aren't just going to tackle one little specific thing that you can measure effectively whether they did it or not. They are more broad programs, and it's harder to measure the effectiveness of broad programs because there's so many variables at play. People began to expect that like overnight things would get better. And these very high expectations left people upset. There were some Americans who felt the Great Society was way too much spending, way too many federal programs, government intrusion. It was going to cause inflation. I mean, there were criticisms, there were arguments beyond underperformance. Speaking of the financial side of things, money doesn't grow on trees. And while America was going through an economic growth period, its wealth was not infinite. And none of this is cheap. Also, America is in the midst of fighting. We are starting to ramp up the Vietnam War, right? 1964 was Gulf of Tonkin. 1965, American combat troops are going to be deployed. The Vietnam War is going to become real in 65. Right? And it's going to start to drain money, and it's going to get even more expensive and more expensive. And pretty soon, it's going to just start draining money. And so Lyndon Johnson is going to find himself trying to balance the financial needs of the Great Society with Vietnam. And at the end of the day, he put money into Vietnam instead of the Great Society because he couldn't lose the war, right? So that's kind of how you have to look at it. Just imagine that the Vietnam War and the Great Society were two people. And they walked into Lyndon Johnson's office and they both said, we need money, right? He's only got $1. He's going to give the dollar to Vietnam every time because he can't lose the war, right? So there wasn't enough funding necessarily for everything the Great Society was trying to do. Now, that's not to say it's a total fail. Some programs still exist today. Medicare, Medicaid, still there today, still heavily funded. The two cabinet departments he created, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, are still there. So is Project Head Start. I do want to point out a lot of poor communities benefited from this. And I want to point out that a lot of minority groups began to get political and bureaucratic experience thanks to this. Because Lyndon Johnson, whenever they would create a program in a neighborhood, they would try to make sure that the program was in part managed or overseen by a member of that community to some degree, right? If you're going to have a program that's designed to benefit, I don't know, Hispanic youth in a certain area, you're probably going to want some Hispanic folks in on the program so they can give feedback, so they can provide advice and guidance. This might be the first opportunity for people in this neighborhood to ever be part of a government program. And I don't mean qualify, I mean actually be part of the management of a government program. So the Great Society provided minority groups across this country with a lot of unique opportunities to be part of government administration and politics. But I guess Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Great Society, much like the New Deal, is the question that it creates, right? What is the role, what should be the role of the federal government in dealing with these problems, right? How far should the federal government go? How much money should it provide? How much should our tax dollars pay for this? Where does the line between private enterprise and government effort? Where is that border, right? At what point should it be, no, this is not the government's problem, it's your problem? Or, the government shouldn't be trying to solve it, we should be trying to solve it, because we know what's best for us. Those are the questions, right? Because if you are impoverished, and you realize the government's got all these things for you, what is your motivation to work your way out of it? What is your motive? If you know the government's going to provide you with health care, and the government's going to provide you with income, and the government's going to provide you with housing, the government's going to give your kids preschool, and the government, what is your motivation to go out and work for anything, right? Now, other side of the coin, I also don't feel comfortable going, well, too bad, poor person, your kid doesn't get opportunities. I'm not comfy with that. I'm also not comfortable with taking an ultra hardcore stance on it, just because, the stereotype that everybody who's living in poverty is a drug addict or is lazy, or, like they did it to themselves, is not 100% correct, because I taught you all about the Great Depression several chapters ago. A lot of people in those breadlines didn't want to be there, okay? And they would have done anything to avoid it. They were hardworking Americans, and the bottom fell out. It wasn't because they made poor choices. And so I try and remember that whenever kind of assessing this question. Who's to say I won't be one of those people, right? It might seem like a stretch, but if you would have asked a person like me in 1930, are you ever going to end up in a breadline? They would have laughed. No, I'm hardworking, I'm educated, I'm this, I'm that. Yeah, a lot of them were unemployed by 1934. And so, there's a part of me that feels like we have to be cautious before we just throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And this idea of, if you give people all these programs, they'll never work. There is some truth to that. But there's also the truth of, so it's sink or swim. Is that really how we want to do this? Lyndon Johnson wanted to make America, a great place. He was trying to be altruistic. Okay. He fell short. And it might be because he was trying to do too much. As the New York Times wrote, the walls of the ghettos are not going to topple overnight, nor is it possible to wipe out the heritage of generations of social, economic, and educational deprivation by the stroke of a presidential pen. And perhaps that is the thing we should remember about the Great Society, or any massive government program that promise us happy days, a free unicorn, whatever. The government cannot magically undo reality, okay? Especially long ingrained reality. And so maybe that was it. Maybe Lyndon Johnson was aiming a little too high. But that is all about Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society. Our next lecture, we will jump to looking at the presidency of Richard Nixon. I know that we've talked about Richard Nixon a little bit in relation to Vietnam, but we are going to look at what happened to America's economy during the Great Society era, basically 1965 onward. Let's look at what happened to the economy. How did we get Richard Nixon? What happened?